Jon Snow stood at the prow of a longship off the coast of the Iron Islands, wind-tossed hair flecked with salt and bitter cold. The gray waters around him swelled and ebbed beneath a dreary autumn sky. He gazed upon the sharp, imposing coastline of Pike, where crooked towers rose out of the ocean like jagged teeth. Seagulls shrieked overhead, fighting the gusts for stable flight. The north still weighed heavily on Jon's mind, but he had come to these seas with a purpose that no Stark or Targaryen had ever dared to pursue in quite the same way. The pact he envisioned with the Ironborn was unorthodox at best, heretical at worst, and yet it might just save them all. He remembered how it began. He had returned to Winterfell after establishing a precarious peace in the north. The White Walkers had been vanquished, though at great cost, and the Iron Throne had changed hands yet again, precariously settled under a reign few deemed stable. The realm was exhausted, splintered by war and the aftermath of the undead threat. Jon had been forced to consider the future of the North, whether it would stand truly independent or bow again to a southern king. Sooner or later, the old feuds would reignite. With food scarce and the scars of war unhealed, the North needed trade. It needed a strong defense of its coasts. Winter may have receded, but winter would always come again. He had stood upon the walls of Winterfell, looking down into the courtyard where the few men who remained after the Great War went about their duties with hollow stares. One question gnawed at him. How would they survive the next threat, whatever it might be, when the North had hardly recovered from the onslaught of the dead? And how could they resist the inevitable pull of southern conflict and intrigue if they remained isolated? The idea came to him like a whisper on the wind. The Greyjoys, the Ironborn, were still proud masters of the seas, cunning in naval battles. They thrived on raids, on exploration, on the water that surrounded their bleak islands. Jon realized that, if he managed to harness that strength in partnership rather than war, it could reshape the entire realm's power balance. The notion was half-formed and fragile, but he shared it quietly with Sansa. She had become the Lady of Winterfell, the unwavering pillar of the North's internal governance. She listened with that keen gaze of hers, refined by pain and bitterness, and though she was skeptical, she did not dismiss him outright. She told him, in a measured voice, that if he could secure an alliance with the Ironborn without losing the North's dignity, it might be worth pursuing. But she also reminded him that the Iron Islands were infamous for treachery and rebellion, that their way of life would not align easily with the honor-driven northern lords. Jon's mind reeled with these truths, but he remained determined. The pact he considered would be no simple trade arrangement. It could come across as an insult to proud men like Lord Glover or Lord Manderley. But the thought of a new path for the North, for the entire realm, kept his spirit firm. He reached out to what remained of House Greyjoy. Yara Greyjoy, who most of the realm still called Asha, had retreated to the Iron Islands after the wars, consolidating her hold over the fractious Ironborn. She had lost men to the undead. She had lost even more to her ambitious and mad Uncle Euron. But she emerged as a hardened leader who understood that the old ways of endless reaving could never fully return. If the Ironborn were to survive, she needed alliances, coin, and recognition of her rule. The news that a northern delegation wished to meet sparked a fleeting curiosity, tempered by caution. She agreed to a small summit on Pike. When Jon set out from White Harbor on a battered old ship, accompanied by a handful of trusted companions, he did so quietly. Word of his departure was kept hidden from most of the northern lords. Only Sansa, Davos, and a few others knew the full extent of his plans. The journey to the Iron Islands was fraught with storms and high winds that roiled the sea. They arrived on the bleak shores of Pike 2 days later than expected, some men seasick, others gripping their sword hilts in case of treachery. A welcome party of Ironborn warriors greeted them under a drizzle that turned the gray stones slick. The meeting would be in the Great Hall of Pike, Yara's seat of power, with the salt-rusted gates and shadowy corridors that smelled of damp and iron. Jon did not come as a supplicant. He wore the heavy cloak of the North, lined with thick fur, and his presence, even overshadowed by the memory of once being called king in the North, demanded a certain level of respect. The Ironborn gave him curt nods and appraising stares. Here was the man rumored to be half Targaryen, the slayer of White Walkers, the one who had turned his back on the Iron Throne. Yet he had come not in open defiance or with an army, but to negotiate. Yara welcomed him, her gaze flicking over the small retinue that followed. "You're bolder than I remember," she said, leading him deeper into Pike's austere halls. Jon answered only with a firm nod, his expression as grim as the stone walls around them. The initial discussions were tense. Yara sat in a chair that might once have belonged to Balon Greyjoy, its arms carved like krakens, the wood darkly stained from years of dampness. She studied Jon across the table. His posture was guarded, but there was an undercurrent of determination in him, as though he had decided on a path and would not easily be turned aside. When he laid out the notion of a naval pact, the few Ironborn in attendance drew sharp breaths. They had never known a Stark to treat with them unless it was to demand fealty, or to punish them after a rebellion. But Jon spoke calmly, addressing their concerns before they were even raised. He spoke of how the North's coastlines needed protection and how the Ironborn, if they so wished, could re-establish their mastery of trade routes, or even expand them. All he asked, in exchange for the North's support in resources and recognition, was their loyalty on the seas, his alliance to help them remain lords of those waters. Yara listened with an unwavering stare, occasionally flicking her gaze to her advisors. She was no fool. She knew the Iron Islands were depleted. Their once proud fleet had been decimated multiple times. Their men were fewer, their larders not always full. And while reaving might still provide for some, it would only provoke the rest of Westeros to clamp down on them. A legitimate pact with the North, overseen by a man who already had proven honor, both in war and in the quiet acceptance of hardships, could grant the Greyjoys a resurgence in power. But she also needed to ensure the Ironborn would not see this as bending the knee in some new form. Her pride bristled at the idea of relying on outside help. Still, it was an opportunity, and so she asked many questions, tested Jon's sincerity, probed for weaknesses in his offer. They spoke late into the night. Yara's men drank heavily, but Jon and his closest advisor, Davos Seaworth, merely sipped the salty ale, focusing on each word, each intonation. Davos chimed in occasionally, bridging the gap between northern pragmatism and Ironborn cunning. He was a smuggler once. After all, a man who understood that alliances could form in the unlikeliest places. There were moments when the tension thickened, but by the time the black sky hinted at a wan, stormy dawn, Yara had not dismissed him. Instead, she invited him to stay a fortnight while she considered his proposal. The fortnight dragged on. Jon walked the stone bridges of Pike, battered by sea winds, peering down at the churning waters that had claimed so many ships across centuries of wars and rebellions. He felt a strange affinity for the place, a harsh realm shaped by the relentless sea, inhabited by a people whose hearts beat to the rhythm of crashing waves. Their songs were about the drowned god, about sails on the horizon, about iron prizes taken from foe after foe. In the gloom of twilight, he watched Ironborn women gleaning mussels from the rocks, old men mending nets. Life on the Iron Islands was bleak, but it was real, forged by necessity. Yara, for her part, tested Jon's sincerity by bringing him to see what remained of the Iron Fleet. There were not many ships compared to its heyday, but enough to instill caution in those who might sail against them. She showed him the shipyards, where new longships were under construction, the docks thick with the smell of tar and damp timber. She explained, in her direct, forthright manner, what the Ironborn would need to stand strong again. More wood, for one, as the islands were barren. They needed supplies, steel, coin, and a reliable trade route. What they lacked in resources, they could make up for in skill. Many of the best sailors in Westeros still came from these shores, having salt in their blood and a steely will to survive any storm. Jon told her what the North could feasibly provide: shipments of lumber from the Wolfswood, shipments of iron from the mines near the mountains, shipments of grain from the more fertile pockets in the north. But he did not promise an endless bounty. The North, too, was rebuilding. The alliance would have to be balanced carefully. When Yara questioned him, her tone sharp, about the North's motives, Jon spoke plainly. "We've fought the dead together. We know how fragile all our kingdoms are. The North stands to gain more than coin. We gain allies upon the seas, the means to guard our coasts. We can stand stronger, should the realm turn on us again." His eyes flickered with old wounds. "I'm done fighting endless wars for thrones. But if war finds us, I'd have us be prepared." After days of these discussions, Yara convened a small council of her captains. Some were fiercely opposed. They saw no benefit in trusting a Stark, no matter his origins. They insisted that if the Ironborn were to rise again, it would be on their own terms, through raids, cunning, and force. Yara argued otherwise. She pointed out that they had tried such rebellion under her father, under her uncle, and each time, the Iron Islands had been brought to heel with bloodshed and humiliations. She reminded them the realm had changed irreversibly. The dragons were gone, again, and the ravages of the long night had made easy spoils rare. Even if they raided, they might pillage an already starving populace that would have no choice but to unite against them with renewed vengeance. Peace, or at least a stable alliance, was the only path to truly rebuild. The debate raged, but gradually a consensus began to form. Yara's closeness to Theon's memory, who had died in the Great War, also influenced her. She recalled how Theon had struggled between loyalty to the North and loyalty to the Iron Islands. He had sought redemption in Winterfell, and in the end, had died protecting Bran Stark from the Night King's forces. Perhaps Yara saw in this proposed pact a way to honor Theon's memory, a bridging of two worlds that he could never fully reconcile. In the Great Hall, under flickering torchlight and the distant roar of the sea, Yara finally told Jon she would accept the broad strokes of his pact. There would be formal details to work out, but she was prepared to shake on it, Ironborn style, so long as he stayed true to his word. Jon extended his hand. The tension in the hall felt like a drawn bow. When their hands clasped, salt and ice, the future shifted. The Greyjoys would rule the seas in the name of their own independence, but with the North's support and recognition. In turn, the Iron Fleet would protect the North shores and shipping lanes, ensuring that northern goods could flow safely. And behind the closed doors of that negotiation, a quiet promise was exchanged. If war came again, Jon would back the Ironborn's right to hold the seas against any who would try to subjugate them anew, so long as their reaving days were redirected toward the North's enemies. It was a gamble, but in times of rebuilding, everything was. The next step was to return to Winterfell and present this pact to the Northern Lords. This would be no trivial matter. Many had lost kin to the Ironborn in raids over the years. Others still recalled how House Bolton had used Ironborn reavers. But Yara agreed to send an emissary, a captain of good repute among the Ironborn, a lean woman named Meryn Pike, to Winterfell to stand witness to the negotiations. Jon took his leave, stepping onto the deck of the longship that would ferry him and his retinue back to White Harbor. As they cast off, Yara stood atop the ramparts of Pike, her cloak snapping in the wind, watching them go. She had a set of iron eyes, but there was an ember of cautious hope in them. The journey north was blessed with clearer skies, though the swirl of uneasy thoughts weighed on Jon's mind. If the North refused this alliance, they might find themselves facing a resentful Ironborn fleet in the future. If the pact went through, they risked stirring old grudges. But the possibility of forging a strong maritime defense and a new trade route that would bring wealth into the battered North felt worth the risk. Davos, standing beside him at the ship's prow, quietly approved of the arrangement. "I've seen what a good fleet can do," he told Jon over a cup of watered wine. Even Stannis, for all his faults, had respect for the sea. "If we treat this right, it could be the making of your legacy, or the breaking." They arrived in White Harbor to a subdued welcome. The Manderleys were polite but guarded, uncertain about the presence of Ironborn among them. Lady Sansa, informed by ravens, had traveled south to meet Jon there rather than waiting in Winterfell. Their meeting in the Great Hall of Newcastle was private and short. She listened to the outline of the pact, her eyes lingering on Captain Meryn Pike, who wore braided hair and scars from a life at sea. Sansa's face betrayed neither approval nor disapproval. She asked pointed questions, ensuring she understood each clause. Jon answered directly, neither hiding his conviction nor underestimating the challenges. In the end, she simply said, "We must call a gathering of the lords. They must hear it from you, from us, and from her." By her, she meant the Ironborn emissary. A fortnight later, under the looming walls of Winterfell, a gathering assembled like no other since the Great War. The hall was chilled by the winter breeze that still clung to the north, though the worst of the snows had melted away. Lords and ladies filed in, some wearing furs dyed in their house colors, others simple gray cloaks. They whispered and muttered, all eyes eventually fixed on Jon Snow, who stood at the head of the gathering with Sansa to his right. Captain Meryn Pike stood at his left, hands clasped behind her back, her posture stiff as she faced the silent scrutiny of centuries-old grudges. Jon spoke with a tone honed by necessity and tested by wars. He reminded them of how the North stood alone for so long, how they had nearly been destroyed by threats from outside, wildling invasions, the army of the dead, the manipulations of southern kings. Now he proposed a shield for the northern coasts, an alliance that would open trade routes and secure the North against future aggression. The price was recognition of the Iron Islands' autonomy on the seas and a measure of mutual respect. At first, the hall erupted with protests. Some voices rose to remind everyone of how the Ironborn had once sacked towns along the stony shore, of how Theon Greyjoy's betrayal led to the occupation of Winterfell. Others worried that forging a pact with the Ironborn would only encourage them, that the North would be seen as associating with thieves and raiders. Sansa intervened coolly, reminding everyone that the world had changed. If the North clung too tightly to old hatreds, they might wither. They needed alliances or, at the very least, naval protection. She gestured for Captain Meryn Pike to speak. The Ironborn woman's voice was low and steady, not schooled in courtesies but seasoned by sincerity. She said that while the Ironborn had indeed wronged the North in the past, the times called for a new shape to things. The Iron Islands were battered, yes, but they remained proud. Pride alone, however, would not fill their stores with grain or build them new ships. What they offered was an honest partnership, a watchful eye upon the seas to guard against pirates, foreign invaders, or any other threat. If the North would stand with the Iron Islands in times of strife, the Iron Fleet would stand with the North. The debate lasted hours, swirling with passion and distrust. Jon did not waver. At times, Sansa shot him a side glance, perhaps silently urging him to temper his words. But he saw no point in half measures. He told the assembled lords that if they would not accept the pact, they must come up with a better solution, for winter would come again, and the North could not pretend to stand alone forever. One by one, some lords began to soften, or at least to realize the inevitability of forging ties. Lord Glover, who had once refused Jon's call to arms, stood with stony reluctance. He admitted that the northern coast was largely undefended, that White Harbor's fleet was small, and that the region's resources were stretched. Bit by bit, the air shifted. No one had a better plan, and Jon's words carried a rare gravity, forged by the memory of the undead. Eventually, Lord Manderley, whose house had a history of maritime pursuits, declared that he would support the pact. Others, seeing a powerful house give its assent, fell in line. Finally, with a solemn nod, Sansa declared that the North would ratify this agreement under the old gods and the new, binding the houses to support it. The mood in the hall was uneasy relief, mingled with apprehension. Yet, as Captain Pike bowed with surprising reverence before the gathering, the tension lessened. Jon, for the first time in many months, felt a cautious sense of accomplishment. The North had taken a step away from isolation, forging a path that might ensure a future with fewer swords at their throats. The pact needed a name. It was to be recorded in the annals of the North and the Iron Islands. Some called it the Pact of Salt and Snow. Others referred to it as the Grey Pact, playing on House Greyjoy's name and the often gloomy northern skies. The specifics were enumerated in plain words. The North would provide raw materials, wood, iron, stone, surplus grain when available, and in return, the Iron Fleet would ensure safe passage of northern merchant vessels, patrolling for pirates or any house that might threaten the North's shipping. Both the North and the Iron Islands would recognize each other's autonomy, swearing not to raise arms against one another. Should an outside force invade either region, the other would come to its defense, as best as possible given distance and timing. Reaving would still be permitted by Ironborn tradition, but never against the North or against any realm with which the North had friendly relations, unless the North was also at war with them. This clause caused a flurry of argument, but was eventually accepted when Yara's letters insisted upon the old Ironborn ways. She would not fully muzzle her captains. The Ironborn identity was entwined with the idea of taking what they needed through might on the seas. Having secured northern consent, Jon sent ravens to Yara, indicating that the pact was sealed. In response, a small Ironborn fleet sailed to White Harbor, carrying gifts of rare fish, pearls, and salted meats. Though meager compared to more lavish southern tributes, it was a symbolic gesture of good faith. Over the next months, trade began to flow in a trickle. Ironborn captains delivered goods from the north to ports as far as the Reach, then brought back coin and other supplies. In turn, more wood and iron were shipped to the islands, allowing them to refit and expand their battered fleet. Sansa and the northern lords, while still watchful, began to see the early fruits of the arrangement. Coins started to jingle in northern purses. Merchants came from the Vale, curious about this new shipping arrangement. The seeds of a maritime network slowly rooted themselves in the stony soil of northern independence. Jon spent much of his time traveling between Winterfell and White Harbor, managing the negotiations that inevitably arose when two proud peoples began working together for the first time in living memory. He had to soothe outraged northern captains when Ironborn sailors practiced their rowdy customs in White Harbor's taverns. He had to remind Ironborn envoys that the North took oaths seriously, and that any treachery would be met with unyielding force. But overall, a tentative peace held. As the months rolled on, Yara extended an invitation for a formal ceremony on Pike, one that would publicly declare the new alliance before the Ironborn. She wanted to show her captains and common folk alike that this pact was not merely a hush-hush arrangement, but something sanctioned by the drowned god's rights. Jon, after much deliberation, decided to accept. He saw the necessity of being present, of forging personal ties that might outlast any paper agreement. So once more, he embarked upon the cold, rough sea. This time, he brought a retinue of northern lords, among them young Lord Umber, who seemed more curious than frightened. Ser Davos came too, in part for his expertise in maritime etiquette, and in part because Jon valued his counsel as a friend and father figure. They arrived at Pike under clearer skies than before, though the dark stone towers still loomed with their customary menace. Yara greeted them in the courtyard, exchanging formalities and embracing Jon in the rough manner of an Ironborn. She led them through the water-slick passages to the castle's heart, where a raised dais had been erected. Several high captains of the Iron Fleet were present, as well as priests of the drowned god, solemn men with seaweed in their hair, chanting prayers that echoed unervingly. A large crowd gathered in the courtyard to witness. Ironborn of all ages, from gaunt fishwives to hardened salt captains. Jon could sense their curiosity, their skepticism, their defiance. But he also saw a hint of acceptance. He was here as an ally, not a conqueror. Yara spoke to her people, her voice carrying over the crash of the waves against the rocks. She recounted the Iron Islands' trials, depleted fleets, many dead from the wars, the old days of rebellious might. She told them of the pact with the North, that it was a new wind for the Ironborn. They would not kneel to southern kings. They would be free upon the seas, recognized by the Starks, who themselves stood free, for the North was no longer subject to the Iron Throne. She acknowledged that some of the old ways would remain. The Ironborn would still take what was theirs, so long as it did not break faith with the new alliance. But she also spoke of forging a better future, with wealth not only from plunder but from trade, from cooperation that would make the Iron Islands strong and feared once more, but also respected. Jon stood beside her, wrapped in his fur cloak. He had no stirring speech prepared, but he spoke simply about what it meant for the North to accept the Ironborn as partners. He spoke of how they had fought side by side against the dead, how Theon Greyjoy had died with honor. He spoke of the bonds formed on the battlefield. Though his words were measured, they struck a chord in some hearts. Then one of the priests of the drowned god stepped forward with a bowl of seawater. Jon hesitated, uncertain what ritual was expected. The priest mumbled a prayer for salt and iron, for new beginnings. Yara dipped her fingers in the bowl and flicked water at Jon, anointing him in a symbolic gesture. She declared him an honored guest of the Iron Islands, recognized by the drowned god if not a devotee. The crowd parted in murmurs. Jon, reluctant but respectful, nodded. He felt droplets slide down his cheeks, mixing with the ever-present sea spray. With that, the official ceremony concluded. Ironborn captains drummed on small casks, and a night of feasting began, though the Iron Islands version of feasting involved more ale than delicacies. Fires roared in braziers, and the strong smell of salt fish pervaded the air. Jon mingled, speaking with some of Yara's men, forging personal connections. They recounted stories of storms at sea, of hunts for krakens, of distant raids on the summer isles. He told them of the long night, how the land itself seemed to freeze under the undead horde. Most of them listened, some in awe, others with skepticism. But a kind of respect was built, man to man, story to story. While the night wore on, Yara pulled Jon aside. They stepped onto a small stone balcony that overlooked the black water. The moon's pale light shimmered on the waves. She asked him, in her typically direct manner, if he truly believed this alliance could last, or if it was but a fleeting respite before the winds changed. Jon, leaning against the damp stone, admitted that he did not know for certain. Westeros was plagued by unpredictable shifts in power and ambition, but he believed that for once, there was a chance to break the cycle of bloodshed between the Iron Islands and the North. He reminded her of Theon's story, how he had found a sort of belonging in both places, yet not completely in either. Perhaps, Jon said quietly, that was a reflection of how their peoples might relate. Never entirely alike, but able to stand beside one another when it mattered. Yara did not speak for a long while, her gaze fixed on the moonlit sea. Finally, she clapped Jon on the shoulder, a gesture more heartfelt than any words she might offer. Then, with a grin, she told him to come drink with her, to show the Ironborn that the quiet wolf could hold his liquor. Jon followed her back into the hall, bracing himself for the pungent ale and the boisterous celebrations. Over the subsequent months, the alliance did indeed show signs of becoming a cornerstone of northern recovery. Cargo ships bearing the sigil of the wolf and the kraken sailed around Westeros, sometimes venturing into the narrow sea to conduct trade with Essos. The profits trickled steadily. Lords in the north who had once viewed the Pact suspiciously found themselves benefiting as their coffers filled, allowing them to rebuild castle walls or restock their food supplies. Ironborn captains, for their part, found new opportunities. Some reaving still happened, especially far off in the Stepstones or among lawless coasts, but it was overshadowed by legitimate trade ventures. Word spread across the Seven Kingdoms, surprising many. Some houses in the Westerlands and the Reach grew wary, suspecting a northern plot to control the seas. Envoys arrived, seeking to understand the nature of this alliance. Jon met them politely, explaining that the pact was purely for mutual benefit and security, not for conquest. Still, in the great game of thrones, any consolidation of power was scrutinized. Some lords feared that a strong northern Ironborn bloc could tip the balance of Westeros's fractious politics. Murmurs of potential conflicts simmered, but for now, no major house dared provoke a newly strengthened North or the battered yet unbroken Iron Fleet. There were, however, inevitable challenges. One came when a rogue Ironborn captain, a distant cousin of Euron Greyjoy, raided a ship from the Vale. The cargo belonged to Lord Royce, who immediately sent a raven of outrage to Winterfell, demanding restitution and the punishment of those responsible. Sansa confronted Jon, who in turn traveled to the Iron Islands to meet Yara. Their conversation in the Great Hall was tense. Yara could not easily hunt down every single freebooting Ironborn who decided to ignore her command, but she also recognized that to maintain the Pact's credibility, she had to act. So an edict was issued from Pike, condemning the rogue captain, promising that any further raids on Northern or Northern Allied vessels would bring the wrath of the Iron Fleet down upon the perpetrators. It was a delicate balance. Yara had to keep her captains loyal, but she also had to ensure that the pact was not undermined by a handful of troublemakers. Ultimately, she placed a bounty on the rogue's head, a fierce message that even Ironborn could pay for breaking the alliance's terms. Within 2 moons, the head of that rogue captain was delivered to Pike, and though the method was barbaric, it sent a clear signal. Yara valued the pact enough to enforce it with brutal efficiency. Another challenge emerged from within the North itself. Some lords began to grumble, especially those who had lost men to Ironborn raids in the past. They questioned whether giving the Ironborn so much access to northern ports was wise. They worried that, once strong, the Ironborn might revert to old ways and hold the North hostage at sea. Jon held multiple councils in Winterfell to address these concerns. He pointed out that the Iron Islands were beholden to the North for the resources needed to rebuild their fleet. If they betrayed them, they would lose that vital supply line. That logic quelled some dissent, but not all. Jon knew that hearts scarred by old wounds did not heal quickly. Perhaps only time would prove that the pact was more than a gamble. Amid these broader political shifts, personal stories unfolded. Northern and Ironborn sailors started to learn from one another. Some took to crewing each other's ships, forging unlikely friendships over shared storms and dangerous waters. A few Northmen adapted to the Ironborn style of worship, or at least tolerated the drowned god's presence, intrigued by the harsh ceremonies that baptized men in the sea. Ironborn raiders, likewise, found themselves strangely moved by the quiet majesty of the old gods in the weirwood groves when they traveled inland. Few would openly admit it, but cultural exchanges began to sprout in subtle ways. Jon's life, meanwhile, had grown more complicated. He was no longer king in the north, having renounced any claim to a throne in favor of letting Sansa rule. Yet the people still looked to him for guidance. He had changed from the wandering outcast who left for the Wall so many years ago, to the white wolf who had warred against the dead, to the man forging an unprecedented alliance. He spent long hours in reflection, sometimes walking alone among Winterfell's ancient corridors. Ghost, his direwolf, remained a constant companion, padding silently by his side. Some nights, Jon would wonder if he had done the right thing by not seeking a simpler life, away from politics. But whenever he saw the North begin to flourish, or saw Ironborn ships leaving White Harbor loaded with trade goods, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Perhaps this was his penance for all the lives lost under his watch. Perhaps this was the best way to honor those who had sacrificed everything to save the realm. As the first year under the Pact drew to a close, a new threat flickered on the horizon. Reports reached Winterfell that a band of outlaws, possibly remnants of the Golden Company or sellswords from Essos, were gathering ships in the narrow sea. They were rumored to be pirates, preying on merchant ships from the Reach and the Stormlands, leaving no survivors. A few caravels bearing the sigil of House Manderly had vanished. The rumor was that these pirates planned to expand their raids northward, drawn by the rumored wealth of northern Ironborn trade. Jon recognized that this was the first real test of the new alliance. If the Iron Fleet could protect northern shipping lanes, the Pact's credibility would be proven. But if the pirates succeeded in terrorizing these routes, it might crumble. Jon sent word to Pike, urging Yara to mobilize her captains. She was eager for a fight. The Ironborn had rarely needed an excuse to do battle at sea, and now they had one that could reinforce their standing. Before the pirates could enter northern waters, the Iron Fleet sailed south, intercepting them near the rocky shores off Crackclaw Point. The ensuing battle was short but brutal. Ironborn longships swept in, ramming the pirate vessels and boarding them with ferocious efficiency. The pirates, many of whom were disorganized and reliant on fear, found themselves outmatched by disciplined Ironborn who lived and breathed seaborne combat. When the smoke cleared, what remained of the pirate fleet was put to the torch, and those who surrendered were either killed or thrown in irons to be displayed later. The Ironborn lost a few men, but the victory was decisive. This triumph echoed across the Seven Kingdoms. The North's shipping lanes remained safe, and the Ironborn stood proud as protectors rather than mere raiders. It was a novel image, the Kraken sigil representing security for merchants instead of a threat. Word of this success made its way to the Red Keep, to Highgarden, to Sunspear. Some lords scoffed at the notion, claiming it was a matter of time before the Ironborn reverted to their base nature. Others admitted grudging respect for the Pact's efficacy. In the months that followed, more trade flowed, coin changed hands, and the North grew more stable. The harvest in the North improved under Sansa's careful stewardship, and the additional profits from maritime commerce allowed for better roads and stronger fortifications. Yara poured resources into building more ships, forging a sense of renewed Ironborn pride. Though occasional tensions flared, the alliance by and large held fast. All the while, Jon found himself in an odd role. He was not the official leader of the North, that was Sansa, nor was he a Greyjoy, yet he often became the mediator between the two worlds. The irony was not lost on him. A man who once knew so little about his own heritage, torn between Stark and Targaryen blood, now served as a bridge between the cold North and the merciless Iron Islands. But for the sake of peace, he labored on. As the second year dawned under the Pact, speculation arose that a southern alliance of lords might attempt to sabotage the North's new maritime power. Rumors flew about envoys traveling to the Iron Islands, offering gold to captains in return for them turning on the North. Yara became incensed, sending word to Jon that she would never bend to southern corruption. But it was a reminder that the realm's politics never truly settled. More ravens flew, more negotiations were held. If the North and the Iron Islands were to remain united, they had to be vigilant against wedges driven by ambitious powers. In the Iron Islands, Yara's position was also tested. Some captains, especially older ones who had lived for nothing but reaving, grew restless with the constraints of the Pact. They whispered that Yara had grown soft, that alliances were the business of Greenlanders. A small mutiny erupted on Great White, where a group of captains tried to crown their own Salt King, claiming the old ways must be revived in full. Yara moved swiftly, dispatching loyal forces to crush the rebellion. Blood was spilled on the rocky beaches, the ringleaders drowned or burned. The message was clear. Yara would not tolerate dissent that threatened the new path she had carved out. The Ironborn might still be reavers at heart, but they would not break faith with the North. Not while Yara wore the Kraken crown. The toll this took on Yara was evident when Jon next visited Pike. She was thinner, her cheekbones more pronounced, and a haunted gleam flickered in her eyes. She confided in Jon that she never realized how difficult it would be to keep the Ironborn in check, balancing their thirst for the old ways with a future that demanded cooperation. Jon understood in his quiet way. He told her about the unrest he faced in the North, how some lords still doubted her people. They shared a moment of weary camaraderie, two rulers of sorts, trying to navigate a new era. That same evening, with the wind howling outside Pike's stone walls, they discussed further expansions to their pact, possible collaborations with the Free Cities, or even distant trading missions across the Sunset Sea. A dreamlike vision of the future arose. Ironborn explorers sailing west, carrying northern goods to unknown lands, returning with spices and textiles. It sounded almost too grand, too fanciful. But it reminded them both that there was a world beyond the narrow conflicts of Westeros, that perhaps new frontiers lay open for those bold enough to reach them. In time, Jon returned to Winterfell, leaving Yara to her struggles. Another harsh winter was likely a few years away yet, but the nights were growing colder. Snow dusted the high passes, and the lakes froze sooner than usual. Sansa was preparing the stores, ensuring the North would be well-fed during the lean months to come. The alliance with the Iron Islands would help, providing the North with fish and goods from warmer climates. Still, the responsibilities piled on Jon's shoulders. He felt the old familiar weight, the sense that fate was always precariously balanced. Travelers spoke of new rumors. Bandits in the Riverlands, a plague in Lannisport, trouble brewing in Dorne. Westeros was always shifting, always fractured. Yet the North and the Iron Islands, two of the most historically distant powers, had carved out a niche of stability. Lords from other regions sent letters to both Winterfell and Pike, probing for trade deals, friendships, or alliances. The unstoppable churn of politics carried on. But for once, Jon felt they had a seat at the table rather than being an afterthought. Whenever he could, Jon slipped away to the godswood. The red leaves of the weirwood tree rustled in the breeze, whispering secrets to those who listened. He would kneel in the snow, or the mud, or the grass, and let his mind wander. Sometimes his thoughts drifted to Samwell Tarly, who had gone to Old Town to rebuild the Maester's ranks after the chaos of the wars. Sometimes he remembered Tormund Giantsbane, who had led free folk back into the true north, forging a fragile existence beyond the wall. He recalled Arya, who had wandered west in search of new horizons, fulfilling some promise to herself to see what lay beyond the map. The realm was scattered like seeds in the wind, but each piece was sprouting something new or withering away. Late in the second year of the Pact, Sansa summoned Jon urgently. A missive had arrived from King's Landing, an invitation to a grand council where the lords of Westeros would discuss matters of realm-wide trade, laws, and possibly even succession should the new royal line fail. The tensions among various great houses were flaring again. Some still yearned to break away, some to unify under a single banner. The question that faced them was simple. How did the North and the Iron Islands present themselves to the rest of the realm? Would they come as equals, demanding recognition of their independence and alliances? Or would they risk losing the tenuous freedoms they had worked so hard to establish? The letter was penned in courteous terms, but there was an undercurrent of challenge. The occupant of the Iron Throne, whoever sat it now, for the seat had changed hands in the war's aftermath, was calling all the major powers together to reaffirm or renegotiate the shape of the Seven Kingdoms. With the Ironborn and the North forging an unexpectedly strong axis of power, others might try to coerce them into bending the knee again. The uncertain swirl of politics threatened to unravel the pact if Jon and Yara did not navigate it carefully. Winterfell's great hall crackled with the warmth of a blazing fire as Jon, Sansa, Davos, and the northern lords convened to decide their course of action. Some advised ignoring the summons altogether, reaffirming the North's independence through non-participation. Others suggested going, but with a show of force. Sansa's measured approach was that they should attend, to demonstrate that the North was not a collection of brigands or isolationists, but a realm that could negotiate on equal footing. Jon agreed. The real debate was about how the Iron Islands would factor into this. A raven was dispatched to Pike, urging Yara to send representatives. If the North showed up in King's Landing with Ironborn allies at its side, they would need a unified message. Weeks passed as the winter winds intensified, but eventually word arrived. Yara herself would sail to the capital. The stage was set for a confrontation of sorts. The North and the Iron Islands would come face to face with the rest of Westeros, to stake their claim to the new reality of power that the Pact of Salt and Snow had created. The months leading to the Grand Council were fraught with preparations. Sansa, always the organizer, made sure the northern retinue was well-equipped and well-guarded. She wanted to present an image of dignity and strength, not bombast, but she had no intention of letting the realm see the North as weak or disordered. Letters flew between Pike and Winterfell, hashing out final points of diplomacy. Yara had her own concerns. Would the capital try to arrest her for old crimes? Would they attempt to subjugate the Iron Islands again? She resolved that if King's Landing tried, she would raise the harbor if necessary. Jon tried to calm her, but the Ironborn spirit was not easily tamed, even in alliance. On a cold morning near the end of autumn, the northern party set out. Jon wore plain but well-made leathers, over which he draped a cloak of dark gray wolf fur. Ghost loped silently at his heel. The knights and lords who accompanied them were a somber bunch, mindful of the perils of southern politics. They traveled slowly, picking their way down the King's Road, which was in better shape than it had been during the wars but still rough in places. Towns along the route greeted them with curiosity, not hostility. Some remembered the tales of Jon Snow, the reluctant king, the hero of the long night. Others looked at the northern banners with a mix of fear and awe, aware that these men were no longer sworn to the Iron Throne. They eventually reached the Trident, where they met up with Yara's forces who had sailed up the river. It was a strange sight. Ironborn longships on the muddy waters of the interior, escorted by a handful of smaller northern vessels that had come to greet them. Yara herself disembarked, wearing a cloak of black leather studded with bits of iron, a salt-stained kraken sigil on her breast. Her captains stood behind her, glowering at the unfamiliar land. The two parties greeted each other tersely at first. Then, with more warmth, once they felt secure there was no ambush. Together, they continued south, an unlikely procession of Northmen on horseback and Ironborn trudging on foot or carting supplies, all heading toward the seat of the Iron Throne. As King's Landing's walls came into view, looming above the Blackwater Bay, memories flooded Jon's mind. He recalled how he had once come to the city as an emissary, only to end up embroiled in battles and betrayals. The city itself had changed some, rebuilt after the destructive war with the dead and the Targaryen conflicts. Streets had been cleared of rubble. New buildings rose from old foundations. Yet the same stench of too many people living too close still hung in the humid air. The gold cloaks lined the main gate, letting the northern retinue and Ironborn pass under watchful eyes. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some spat curses at the Ironborn. Others simply stared at the imposing presence of the wolf banners. They were guided to accommodations near the Red Keep, though Jon noted the tension in the guards, who clearly did not relish having Ironborn so close to the seat of power. Over the next 2 days, more lords arrived from across Westeros. Proud bannermen from the Reach, sullen and weary knights from the Stormlands, a delegation from the Vale led by Lord Royce, who glared warily at the Ironborn. The Targaryen question was overshadowed now by the reality that the throne was held by another line, but there was always a possibility of disputes about who deserved the crown. Gossip buzzed everywhere. 1,000 alliances, feuds, half-truths, and vendettas churned in the city's underbelly. Finally, the Grand Council convened in the throne room. Jon had not stepped foot in that cavernous hall since he had knelt to the would-be Queen Daenerys Targaryen so long ago. Now, the occupant of the throne was a ruler who claimed to be forging a new era of peace. Jon wasn't entirely sure of their sincerity. The king, robed in fine velvet and flanked by members of the Kingsguard, welcomed the assembled lords in a sonorous voice. One by one, they stated their names and intentions. When it came time for Jon and Yara, they approached together, drawing a hush over the throng. Two improbable allies, side by side, the Northman with the ghostly pale direwolf at his side, and the Ironborn queen in all but name, wearing salt-stained regalia. They stood before the Iron Throne, silent, letting the tension build. The king's expression flickered with barely concealed unease. He asked them to affirm their fealty, to declare their intent within the realm. Jon, his jaw set, calmly stated that the North was an independent kingdom, recognized as such after the wars, and that it had entered into a mutual defense and trade pact with the Iron Islands, which also stood separate, neither kneeling nor paying fealty to the crown. A ripple of discontent spread among certain lords. The king raised a hand for silence. He reminded them of the dire need for unity. He alluded to the memory of the White Walkers the devastation wrought. He questioned whether it was truly wise to have two corners of Westeros effectively seceded from the rest. Jon kept his voice calm as he replied, "We have not seceded from the realm's well-being. We are here, are we not? Our alliance does not threaten peace. It strengthens it. As we stand independent, we do not plot to conquer. We simply refuse to be subject to a throne that has changed hands too many times, at too great a cost." Yara nodded sharply, adding in her own brusque tone that the Iron Islands would never again bow to any who could not command the seas. "If the realm wishes to remain at peace with us, then let it. We have no quarrel with those who leave us be." It was a tense moment. The king seemed torn between wanting to keep the peace and not wanting to appear weak in front of the other great houses. But the mood in the hall was one of resignation. Few had the appetite for a new war, and the demonstration of the North and Iron Islands standing in lockstep was daunting. Lords glanced at each other, weighing their options. In the end, the king opted for a conciliatory approach, acknowledging the cost of further conflict would be too high. He declared that the crown recognized the existing autonomy of the North and the Iron Islands, so long as they adhered to certain conditions of non-aggression and continued cooperation in broader Westeros matters, such as defending against foreign invasions or unforeseen catastrophes. Relieved murmurs spread. Yara placed a fist over her chest, signifying grudging acceptance. Jon inclined his head, remaining stoic. As the sessions of the Grand Council proceeded over the following days, details were hammered out. Trade routes across the realm would be regulated, with the North and Iron Islands guaranteeing not to disrupt commerce for other kingdoms. In return, the Crown and the Southern Lords would not hinder the Northern Ironborn Alliance's growth at sea. Discussions about succession and titles meandered, but ultimately, the question of immediate power overshadowed them. By the Council's end, a fragile peace was maintained, with an unspoken awareness that any major betrayal could ignite yet another war that no one had the stomach for. In the final gathering, the king stood before the assembled lords and made a gesture of goodwill. He acknowledged that times were changing, and that perhaps the realm's unity no longer required every inch of land and sea to bow to the same crown. He expressed hope that this new shape of alliances, though unconventional, might lead to stability after generations of upheaval. Jon said little, but in his mind, he felt a cautious sense of vindication. He had helped carve out a space where the North and Iron Islands could exist on their own terms, side by side. Whether it would last a generation or crumble with the next crisis, only time would tell. After that, the delegations made their preparations to depart. The city's small folk watched with curiosity as the bizarre spectacle of Northern Lords and Ironborn Reavers departed side by side. Once more, Yara's ships sailed up the Blackwater, this time accompanied by some southern merchant ships looking to strike deals. Jon led the northern party back up the King's Road, Ghost trotting faithfully alongside. A few outriders from the Vale joined them for part of the journey, ensuring no bandits dared test their mettle. Upon returning to Winterfell, the traveling party disbanded, and the lords took their leave for their own holds. The short northern summer was nearing its end, giving way to the creeping chill of autumn. Sansa embraced Jon in the courtyard, relieved to see him safely returned. They spoke quietly in her solar about the events in King's Landing and the significance of having the crown acknowledge their pact. "It's a momentous change," she admitted softly. "Father always taught us that the North was different, but I don't think he ever dreamed of a scenario like this." Jon just nodded, remembering how Ned Stark had tried to keep the North safe under Baratheon rule, how those old oaths had bound them to tragedies. This was a new time with new solutions. Though the conversation ended, the ramifications would echo for years. The alliance with the Greyjoys stood as a daring experiment in Westeros. Two proud and historically embittered regions forging a partnership that gave them mutual strength. The roads to the future branched in many directions, some leading to continued prosperity, others to hidden pitfalls. But for the time being, a measure of hope took root. Trade flourished, the seas were safer, and there was a sense that the North, at last, could define its own destiny without Southern meddling. The Ironborn, too, regained a semblance of their old renown, if not the exact same methods of acquiring it. In Pike's harbors, new ships were christened under the watch of drowned men, their prows carved in the shape of wolves or krakens, signifying the link between salt and snow. In Winterfell, the lords adapted to seeing Ironborn visitors in the Great Hall, speaking of cargo manifests rather than iron price. Some welcomed it. Others muttered that it was an abomination. But the leadership of Jon and Yara set the tone, pushing forward despite resistance. If old hatreds could not be entirely extinguished, perhaps they could be soothed by shared interest and the promise of a safer tomorrow. Time would reveal whether the pact ushered in a golden age or served only as a respite in the endless cycles of war. For now, though, it held, under sullen skies, in the hush of the Godswood or the echoing halls of Pike, the promise of the pact of salt and snow stood like a stubborn flame against the cold gloom of history. It was a testament to what the living could achieve when necessity and vision aligned, forging a bond from the very elements that once divided them. And Jon Snow, the man of two worlds, found a measure of peace in the knowledge that, for once, he had given Westeros a chance to find its balance before the next harsh winter inevitably arrived.